The evening of June the 5th, 1944, General Dwight D. Eisenhower sat alone in his trailer in southern England. He had just made the decision that would send over 150,000 men across the English Channel. The weather was marginal, with low clouds and rough seas. His meteorologists had given him a narrow window, but the storm might still return. Eisenhower knew that if the invasion failed, blame would fall squarely on him. He took out a piece of paper and wrote a short statement, one he hoped he would never need. It acknowledged that the Normandy landings had been repulsed and that he alone bore full responsibility. Hours later, the vast armada began to move. More than 2,700 vessels steamed from ports all across southern England. Minesweepers had already cleared 10 channels through the German minefields. Submarines from the Royal Navy sat offshore, marking the approach routes with their lights. The men on the decks of the troopships and landing craft could smell the salt air and feel the chill of the wind. No one knew if the gamble would work. The Atlantic Wall had been 2 years in the building, and the German divisions waiting on the other side were among the best in the world. The path to that moment began 2 years earlier, on a shingle beach in northern France. A much smaller force had been shattered by the German defenders. That failure on August the 19th, 1942, at a French port called Dieppe, would teach the Allies what not to do. And from those hard lessons, a new way of waging war from the sea would begin to take shape. The Dieppe raid was conceived by the British Chief of Combined Operations, Vice Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. The plan was to seize a major German-held port, hold it for a few hours, gather intelligence, test German reactions, and then withdraw. It was not meant to be an invasion but a large-scale raid, a trial of the Atlantic Wall. Some 6,100 troops were committed, the bulk of them from the Canadian Army. There had been little specialized training for amphibious operations. The planners assumed that surprise, naval gunfire, and close air support would be enough to get the men off the beaches and into the town. But almost nothing went according to plan. In the middle of the night, the flank landing craft stumbled into a German coastal convoy. The brief naval engagement alerted the shore defenses. The main assault force hit the beaches at dawn, only to find the shingle was steep and loose. The tanks that were supposed to support the infantry ground to a halt, their tracks spinning uselessly on the deep pebbles. The destroyers offshore fired 4-inch shells, but they did little damage to the concrete bunkers that lined the promenade. The Spitfire squadrons overhead were operating at the very edge of their range and could not dominate the skies. The result was a massacre. Of the 6,100 men who had embarked, over 1,000 were killed and 2,300 captured. The survivors came back to England wounded and exhausted. Many of the Canadian regiments were shattered as fighting units. The medical evacuation boats found the waters churning with wreckage and bodies. The stench of smoke and cordite drifted across the English Channel. For the men who had been there, the image of that beach, littered with burning tanks and fallen soldiers, would never fade. But Dieppe was not simply a disaster, it was a brutal education. The post-action reports compiled by staff officers who had watched the raid from offshore made for grim reading. No command ship had coordinated the landing. Intelligence had been poor. The naval bombardment had been far too light. The Air Force had not achieved local air superiority. Most critically, no specialized equipment existed to clear beach obstacles or climb the sea wall. From that catalogue of failure, a new approach began to emerge. A British general, Percy Hobart, who had been sidelined for years, was now given the resources to develop a range of specialized armored vehicles designed specifically to solve the problems that had killed so many Canadians at Dieppe. 3 months after Dieppe, the Allies launched their first large-scale amphibious invasion. Operation Torch, in November of 1942, was aimed at French North Africa. The planning was overseen from Gibraltar by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was taking his first major command of the war. Some 75,000 troops were involved in the initial landings, supported by 4 fleet carriers and 5 smaller carriers. The distances were enormous. The American invasion force sailed directly from the east coast of the United States. The British convoys came from the Clyde. All of them had to cross waters still patrolled by German U-boats. The torch landings succeeded where Dieppe had failed. At Oran and Algiers, the command ships HMS Largs and HMS Bololo served as floating headquarters, coordinating the movements of the landing craft, the naval bombardment, and the air cover from a single, well-organized room. The naval gunfire was far heavier. The carrier-borne aircraft dominated the skies. On the beaches there was confusion. Certainly. Landing craft arrived in the wrong places. The surf was rougher than expected, but the troops got ashore, and within 3 days, the ports of Casablanca, Oran, and Algiers were in Allied hands. The Vichy French garrison, after a token fight, surrendered. Torch was a victory, but it was a victory against limited opposition. The Vichy French forces did not have the training or the will of the German army. The real test would come when the Allies faced the Wehrmacht defending a coastline. Yet the lessons of Dieppe and Torch established a pattern. The need for specialized equipment, dedicated command ships, overwhelming naval gunfire, and absolute air superiority was now understood. The causal chain had begun. Dieppe showed what did not work. Torch showed what was possible when the right tools were in place. Both operations would shape the planning for Normandy. And in the offices of combined operations, Admiral Bertram Ramsay was already beginning to lay the groundwork for the great invasion to come. The morning of June 4th, 1942, the Pacific Ocean, northwest of Midway Atoll. American scout planes had spotted the Japanese fleet the day before, but now the carriers were launching. On the flight decks of the USS Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, dauntless dive bombers and Devastator torpedo planes warmed up their engines. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, leading Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, had broken radio silence to give his men a final grim heading. He told them to follow him, because the Japanese carriers would be waiting. Waldron's squadron found the Japanese fleet. They attacked without fighter cover. Of the 15 Devastators in his squadron, every single one was shot down by Mitsubishi Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. Only one man, Ensign George H. Gay, survived the attack, floating in the water and watching the battle unfold above him. The Japanese carriers had dodged the torpedoes, and for a moment it seemed the American attack had been a total failure. But Waldron's sacrifice had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The sky above the carriers was left wide open. At precisely 10:22, the dive bombers from the Enterprise arrived. Their commander had made a critical navigational gamble, continuing his search beyond his fuel's safe limit. He found the Japanese fleet, and his squadron dropped from 18,000 feet. Within 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived the first wave and launched a counterstrike that crippled the Yorktown, but American scouts found her by late afternoon. Dive bombers from the Enterprise set Hiryu ablaze. The Japanese lost 4 fleet carriers in a single day. Back at Pearl Harbor, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz studied the reports from the battle. The grease-stained after-action logs from the Enterprise and Yorktown told a story of desperate courage and fragile machines. The American torpedo planes had been nearly useless, their Mark 13 torpedoes running too deep or failing to detonate. If the dive bombers had arrived just 10 minutes later, the battle could have turned out very differently. Nimitz knew the victory at Midway had bought time, but it had not won the war. The United States Navy was still outnumbered in capital ships, and the Japanese army was still advancing across the Pacific. The problem of the faulty torpedoes was not limited to the air. American submarine commanders patrolling the waters around the Japanese home islands were experiencing the same frustration. A submarine captain could spend hours maneuvering into a perfect firing position, only to hear a dull thud as the Mark 14 torpedo struck the hull of a Japanese tanker without exploding. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refused to believe the reports. They told the captains to get closer before firing. The resentment grew. In the wardrooms of boats like the USS Wahoo and USS Harder, the men knew their weapons were defective, but no one in command seemed willing to fix them. 2 months after Midway, the focus shifted to a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal. They came ashore against light opposition, seizing the nearly completed Japanese airfield. Within hours, they renamed it Henderson Field. The Marines were in control of the runway, but they were not in control of the sea. The Japanese Navy reacted swiftly. That night, a force of cruisers and destroyers slipped down the slot and caught the Allied transport fleet off guard, sinking 4 heavy cruisers and scattering the supply ships. The Marines on Guadalcanal were left stranded. They had only the supplies they had carried ashore in their packs. The engineers worked frantically to get Henderson Field operational, using captured Japanese equipment. The first aircraft arrived, a handful of Marine Wildcats and Dauntless bombers. They were exhausted, their pilots sleeping in foxholes next to the runway. The airfield became the heart of the American defense. Every Japanese attempt to reinforce their garrison or bombard the beaches was met by aircraft from Henderson Field, call sign Cactus Air Force. The naval battle for Guadalcanal became a grinding attrition of surface actions. The waters of Iron Bottom Sound swallowed dozens of ships. The American Navy lost 2 more heavy cruisers and 7 destroyers in a single night in November. But the Japanese also lost 2 battleships. Each side poured in reinforcements. The Japanese ran the Tokyo Express down the slot every night, but they never managed to dislodge the Marines by December. The Japanese High Command realized their garrison was starving faster than they could supply it. The decision was made to abandon the island. The logistics of sustaining Guadalcanal were a nightmare. The supply line stretched 6,000 miles from San Francisco to the front. Every gallon of avgas, every crate of food, every replacement carburetor had to come by ship. The Navy struggled to keep the convoy routes open. The situation was so dire that Admiral Nimitz personally ordered the dispatch of a fast transport convoy in late October, knowing it would arrive without escort and rely entirely on speed. The gamble worked, but it showed the razor-thin margin of the entire operation. By February of 1943, the last Japanese troops had been evacuated from Guadalcanal. The campaign had cost the United States over 1,600 dead and 4,200 wounded. The Japanese losses were far higher. The myth of Japanese invincibility on land was broken. The Americans had proved they could take a beachhead, hold it under constant air and naval attack, and sustain it at extreme distance. The lesson was not lost on the planners in Washington. Guadalcanal was the template for every Pacific Island campaign to come. On April 18, 1943, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese radio message. It detailed an inspection tour by Admiral Izoruku Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the combined fleet. The message included his exact flight plan and schedule. The man who had conceived the attack on Pearl Harbor was flying to Bougainville. Admiral Nimitz faced a difficult decision. Killing Yamamoto was a military target, but it would also reveal to the Japanese that their codes were broken. Nimitz authorized the strike. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters from the 339th Fighter Squadron took off from Henderson Field. Their flight path was timed to intercept Yamamoto's 2 Betty bombers. The Lightnings climbed to 30,000 feet, maintaining radio silence. As the Japanese formation approached Bougainville, the P-38s dropped their external fuel tanks and dove. The lead pilot closed on the bomber. His guns tore into the Betty, and it crashed into the jungle below. Yamamoto was dead. The death of Admiral Yamamoto was a devastating blow to Japanese naval morale. He had been the strategic mind behind the entire Pacific War plan. His successor, Admiral Koga, inherited a fleet that was already bleeding from Midway and the Solomon Islands campaign. The Japanese Navy lost its most aggressive and innovative commander. The American submarine campaign, meanwhile, continued to suffer from its defective torpedoes. The frustration among submarine captains was reaching a boiling point. In the summer of 1943, Admiral Lockwood, the Pacific submarine commander, finally forced a live warhead test. He had his men fire 5 Mark 14 torpedoes at a submerged cliff face in Malaya Bay, Hawaii. None of them detonated. The test proved what the captains had been saying for months. The Bureau of Ordnance was forced to admit the fault. The magnetic exploder was too sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field, and the contact pin was too weak to trigger the explosive. A crash redesign was ordered. By late 1943, the first reliable torpedoes began reaching the fleet. The spring of 1943 marked a fundamental transition. The Marianas and the Gilberts were still ahead. The B-29 Superfortress was still a troubled prototype in Kansas. But the strategic tide had turned. The Japanese would never regain the initiative. The path to Tokyo was still long, but the Americans now had the time to build the tools they needed. The summer of 1943 brought the Allies to a new threshold. After securing North Africa, they set their sights on Sicily, the first step into Europe. Operation Husky was the largest amphibious assault yet attempted. On July the 9th, an armada of 3,000 ships converged on the southern coast of Sicily. 150,000 troops were scheduled to land on the first day alone. Admiral Ramsay, fresh from his work on Torch, now commanded the naval side of this massive effort. The landings themselves were a confusing business. Waves of landing craft came ashore at two separate 40-mile stretches of beach. Many units landed in the wrong places, scattered by strong winds and poor visibility. Yet the opposition was surprisingly light. The Italian coastal units offered only weak resistance, and the German garrison was still small. Within hours, the beachheads were secured. But the German response revealed a harsh pattern. The two combat-hardened Wehrmacht divisions on the island quickly entered the fight. They conducted a series of sharp counterattacks that slowed the Allied advance to a crawl. Even outnumbered, the German troops proved expert at holding ground in the mountainous interior. The Allies had hoped to trap the garrison, but the Germans were already planning their escape. They pulled back methodically, demolishing bridges and mining roads as they went. By mid-August, the last German soldier had crossed the Strait of Messina into Italy. Allied commanders received the news with mixed emotions. The evacuation had been almost uninterrupted, with heavy equipment saved for future battles. Operation Husky had succeeded in seizing the island, but it had failed to destroy the enemy. The lesson was clear. Even a successful amphibious landing could be followed by a frustrating grind. The German skill at defensive warfare would have to be faced more directly in the coming months. The post-landing analysis highlighted several critical points. Naval gunfire had been helpful, but not decisive against well-placed coastal batteries. Air support had been stretched thin, and the Luftwaffe had still managed to inflict damage. The need for better coordination between ships, aircraft, and ground troops was now obvious. These insights would shape the planning for the next great test, the invasion of mainland Italy. Ramsay and his staff filed their reports, already looking ahead. The Italian government surrendered in early September, raising hopes of a quick campaign. But the German High Command had anticipated this. Field Marshal Kesselring immediately took control of the defense of central Italy. On September the 9th, the Allies launched Operation Avalanche, a direct assault on the port of Salerno. 55,000 troops poured ashore in the pre-dawn darkness. The landings were unopposed, but the real fight was yet to come. Within hours, the German 16th Panzer Division struck back with devastating force. Their tanks and infantry drove wedges between the American and British beachheads. By the third day, the situation was critical. The Germans had pushed within half a mile of the shore. General Clark, the ground commander, privately made plans to re-embark his headquarters. Disaster seemed close at hand. The response was a frantic concentration of Allied firepower. Battleships like HMS Warspite moved close inshore and hurled 15-inch shells at German positions miles inland. Every available aircraft in the Mediterranean theater was thrown into the battle. The 82nd Airborne Division was rushed from Tunisia and dropped behind the beachhead. Slowly, the German pressure began to ease. By September the 16th, Kesselring had pulled his divisions back to a new defensive line. Salerno had been saved, but the margin was terrifyingly thin. The Luftwaffe had struck the crowded beaches with near impunity on the first days. Their attacks had destroyed several ships and caused hundreds of casualties. The lesson was unforgettably harsh. Without air supremacy, any amphibious operation was vulnerable. From this point forward, Allied planners insisted on overwhelming aerial support before any major landing. The ghost of Salerno would haunt the preparations for Normandy. The final tally showed the cost of the narrow escape. Over 3,500 Allied casualties had been suffered on the beaches. But the operation also proved that determined naval gunfire and rapid reinforcement could hold a beachhead. The concept of the command headquarters ship, tested at Torch, worked well here again. Communications between ships and shore, though still imperfect, had improved. Each landing added another piece to the evolving doctrine of amphibious warfare. While the Mediterranean campaign drained German reserves, the war in the Pacific took a decisive turn. In November of 1943, the United States launched its first major amphibious assault across the Central Pacific. The target was the Gilbert Islands, specifically the tiny atoll of Betio in the Tarawa Lagoon. 18,000 Marines of the 2nd Division prepared to assault a coral island, defended by 3,000 Japanese. The operation would test every lesson learned so far, and it would reveal how much more there was to learn. From the start, things went wrong. The naval bombardment had been carefully scheduled, but largely missed the reinforced Japanese bunkers. The tide was unexpectedly low, leaving the landing craft stuck on the outer reef. Marines were forced to wade 700 yards through waist-deep water under machine gun fire. The result was a slaughter. Over 1,000 Americans died in the first 76 hours of fighting. The Marines who made it to shore faced a nightmare of coral palm logs and hidden pillboxes. The Japanese defenders, dug into concrete bunkers, fought to the last man. Wave after wave of landing craft ferried reinforcements into the chaos. It took 3 days of intense close-quarters combat to finally secure the island. The photographs of dead Marines floating in the surf shocked the American public. Tarawa was a victory, but the price raised urgent questions. The post-action analysis was brutal. Intelligence had failed to reveal the reefs or the strength of the defenses. The pre-invasion bombardment had been too short and too inaccurate. The landing craft were unsuitable for coral conditions. From this painful experience came a list of improvements: better reconnaissance, longer heavy naval gunfire, and the mass production of amphibious tractors that could cross reefs. These fixes would be ready for the next great step, the invasion of the Marianas. By the time the last shots were fired at Tarawa, another change was underway far from the beaches. The faulty Mark 14 torpedoes that had frustrated American submarine commanders were finally being replaced. Admiral Lockwood's stubborn testing had forced the Bureau of Ordnance to admit its error. By the autumn of 1943, reliable torpedoes began to reach the fleet. The effect was immediate and devastating. Japanese merchant ships started sinking in numbers that would soon strangle the Empire's supply lines. By January of 1944, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had ground to a halt against the Gustav Line. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had turned every river valley and mountain ridge into a fortified killing ground. The solution on paper seemed elegant enough: an amphibious end run. Land a corps behind the German lines at Anzio, just 30 miles south of Rome, and cut the supply routes that fed the Gustav defenses. The plan carried the weight of earlier Mediterranean landings, but it also carried a warning from Salerno about what happened when a beachhead hesitated. On the morning of January the 22nd, the first wave of Operation Shingle came ashore exactly where planned. The beaches were silent. Not a single German defender fired a shot. Within hours, 36,000 Allied troops and their equipment were on the sand, and the road to Rome lay open. Major General John L. Lucas, commanding the American 6th Corps, watched his divisions land with growing unease. His intelligence reports had warned that the Germans could react fast. He decided to consolidate the beachhead before pushing inland, and that decision cost him the campaign. Kesselring did not hesitate. His staff had already prepared contingency plans for exactly this kind of landing, and within a week, he had rushed elements of 8 divisions to the Anzio perimeter. The German reaction was a masterpiece of improvisation, using every available unit scraped from the Gustav Line, northern Italy, and even the Balkans. They arrived piecemeal but fast, and they dug in before Lucas could move his main force. By the time the 6th Corps was ready to advance, the Germans were waiting in strength. The open road to Rome had become a fortified horseshoe. The beachhead became a cage. German artillery zeroed in on every supply dump and landing craft. Snipers controlled the scrubland beyond the perimeter, and Luftwaffe bombers hit the beaches when the weather cleared. Lucas's divisions could barely extend their lines a mile, let alone drive for Rome. The stalemate dragged on through February and into March, pinning down the entire Allied landing force in a shrinking pocket of Italian coast. Churchill famously called it a beached whale, all mass and no momentum. The Anzio stalemate reports, still damp with sea spray and stained with salt, arrived in London with their conclusions starkly underlined. A successful amphibious landing meant nothing without aggressive exploitation. The caution that had seemed prudent to Lucas, the wait for reinforcements and heavy equipment, had handed Kesselring the time he needed to seal the beachhead. Allied planners studying those reports took careful note. If a similar operation was ever launched against France, there would be no consolidation. The landing force would have to drive inland from the first hour before the Germans could react. While the Italian campaign stagnated, the war in the Pacific accelerated. The lessons of Tarawa had been digested, debated, and turned into doctrine. Pre-invasion bombardments would be longer and more accurate. Amphibious tractors, The tracked vehicles that could cross coral reefs without stranding were mass-produced and distributed to the assault divisions. The target was the Marshall Islands, specifically the atolls of Kwajalein and Majuro. And the plan was to test the revised doctrine at full scale. The fast carrier task forces had grown into something unprecedented by February of 1944. Task Force 58 could put over 700 aircraft in the air, and its commanders had learned the rhythms of carrier warfare through a year of hard experience. They launched pre-invasion strikes that pulverized Japanese airfields on the outer Marshall Islands, eliminating any chance of aerial interference. The carriers then shifted to direct support, their dive bombers and fighters working in close coordination with the naval gunfire ships that hammered the beach defenses from battleship range. When the first waves of Marines and Army troops went ashore at Kwajalein on the 1st of February, the difference from Tarawa was immediate. The naval bombardment had been deliberate and sustained, with heavy battleships firing at close range for over 2 hours. The amphibious tractors crawled over the fringing reef without stopping, and the landing craft followed the paths they had cleared. Japanese resistance was still fierce. The garrison fought to the last man, but the assault forces were not pinned on the beach. They advanced inland through the palm groves and blockhouses. Majuro fell even faster, captured without a single American combat death. The Seabees landed within hours of the last shots and started building immediately, converting a ring of coral sand into a major fleet base within weeks. They constructed runways, fuel depots, repair shops, and barracks, transforming the atoll into a fully functioning logistical hub. The Seabees kept meticulous logs of every yard of runway and every gallon of storage capacity, and those records became the template for every forward base that followed. The Marshall's campaign demonstrated a strategic principle that would define the rest of the Pacific War. The American fleet had learned to bypass the strongly defended islands and let their garrisons wither in isolation. The fast carriers isolated Japanese strongpoints by cutting their sea lines, and the bypassed garrisons were left to starve on their coral outposts, while the fleet drove deeper into the Pacific. Kwajalein and Majuro were secured. The outer defenses of the Japanese perimeter had been cracked, and the road to the Marianas was open. In March of 1944, the first operational B-29 Superfortress squadrons were declared ready for combat, bringing a weapon of entirely new reach into the Pacific theater. The bomber had been in development since 1939, and its journey from blueprint to runway had been one of the most difficult engineering projects of the war. The airframe was enormous, with a wingspan of 141 feet, and it carried a bomb load that dwarfed anything that had come before. Its unrefueled range of over 3,000 miles gave it the ability to strike Japan from bases that were safely beyond Japanese interception. The Superfortress was not an easy machine to perfect. Its right engines had a persistent tendency to overheat and catch fire during the long climbs to altitude, and the pressurized cabin required an awkward crawl tunnel over the bomb bays to connect the forward and rear sections of the aircraft. Engineers at Boeing's Wichita plant called the frantic effort to solve these problems the Battle of Kansas, a grim joke that undersold the seriousness of the crisis. Aircraft sat grounded for weeks as mechanics worked through modifications, and there was serious discussion about cancelling the entire program. The first B-29 groups were deployed to bases in eastern India and central China under a plan code named Operation Matterhorn. The strategic logic was sound from Chengdu. The bombers could reach the Japanese home islands, something no other Allied bomber could do. The cost was staggering. Every gallon of fuel and every bomb had to be flown over the Himalayan hump at enormous expense, consuming most of what the transport aircraft delivered just to keep themselves operational. The campaign from China was limited to a handful of missions per month. The superfortresses began arriving at their forward bases during the spring of 1944, with ground crews assembling aircraft that had been shipped in crates across the Indian Ocean. The runways had to be widened and reinforced to handle the weight of a fully loaded bomber, over 60 tons at takeoff. Engineering battalions carved new airfields out of the rice paddies and hillsides of southern China, and the first squadrons were declared operational by late spring. The logistical challenges remained immense, but the strategic principle had been established. The basing in China was always understood as a temporary measure, a bridge to something larger. The real prize was the Marianas, flat enough for long runways and close enough to Tokyo to allow the B-29s to fly with full bomb loads without the Himalayan supply chain. Intelligence officers and logistics planners at Pearl Harbor had already begun mapping the airfields that would be built once the islands were taken, and the Seabees were preparing their equipment for the next leap. The superfortress represented the final strategic piece of the Pacific campaign, the weapon that would carry the war directly to the Japanese homeland. All that remained was to seize the ground from which they would operate. By June the 5th, 1944, the southern coast of England had become a floating arsenal. Over 2,700 vessels packed every harbour and estuary from Portsmouth to Plymouth, their decks crowded with landing craft, tanks, and over 130,000 soldiers. The minesweepers had already departed at dusk, cutting 10 narrow channels through the German minefields in the channel. Behind them, Royal Navy submarines slipped out ahead of the main force, marking the approach routes for the assault ships that would follow before dawn. The largest amphibious operation in history was underway. The scale of this movement was almost beyond comprehension. Admiral Ramsay and his planning staff had spent months orchestrating every detail: the timing of each wave, the lanes for each convoy, the refueling points, the emergency towing procedures. In the first wave alone, 2,000 tanks and 12,000 vehicles would need to cross the channel and land on a narrow stretch of French coastline. The logistical choreography required that every vessel arrive at its designated launching point within minutes of schedule. Any delay would create a bottleneck on the beaches that the German defenders could exploit. The weather almost destroyed the entire plan. A large depression had swept in from the Atlantic on the 3rd of June, bringing low clouds, heavy rain, and gale-force winds that would make beach landings impossible. The meteorologists forecast a narrow window of improved weather on the 6th. Eisenhower, sitting alone in his trailer, made the decision to go. He wrote a brief contingency letter, acknowledging that the invasion had failed and that he accepted full responsibility. He folded it into his wallet and gave the final order for the Armada to sail. That night, the German command concluded that an invasion was impossible in such conditions. Field Marshal Rommel drove back to Germany for his wife's birthday. The German High Command had positioned 58 divisions across France and the Low Countries, but the majority were static garrison units without the transport to move quickly. Rommel had wanted the panzer divisions deployed close to the beaches, ready to crush the invaders in the first hours. Other senior commanders preferred to hold them inland, waiting to launch a massive counterattack after the Allies had committed their forces. Hitler's compromise satisfied no one. Some divisions were scattered along the coastline, while 4 elite panzer divisions were held far back and could only be released by direct order from the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. On the night of June the 5th, not a single alert reached Army Group Commander Erwin Rommel's headquarters. The Atlantic Wall was waiting, but its best troops were not yet moving. The Armada crossed the channel through the darkness, its approach protected by an overwhelming naval and aerial screen. Over 1,200 Allied fighters patrolled the skies above the fleet, flying continuous overlapping patrols from before dawn until nightfall. The Luftwaffe's Third Fleet could muster only 170 operational aircraft to contest the entire coastline of Western Europe. The German Navy sent out its remaining destroyers and E-boats, but they were detected by radar, hammered by Coastal Command aircraft, and driven back by the destroyer screens. By the time the first landing craft began their run toward the beaches, the Allies had achieved complete command of both the sea and the air over the invasion zone. The gamble of June the 5th had bought them a narrow window, and they used every second of it. The pre-dawn bombardment was the most concentrated naval fire support ever delivered. 7 battleships, 23 cruisers, and over 100 destroyers opened fire on the German coastal fortifications along a 50-mile front. The old battleships of the American and British navies, judged too slow for fleet actions but ideal for shore bombardment, fired their main batteries at the concrete bunkers and gun emplacements. The heavier shells from the 15-inch guns of the Royal Navy's monitors punched through reinforced roofs that aerial bombs had barely scratched. Behind the battleships, the destroyers moved closer inshore, firing at the beach obstacles and machine gun positions until the very moment the first landing craft touched sand. At the westernmost landing zone, Utah Beach, the assault went almost perfectly. Strong currents pushed the landing craft a mile south of their intended target into a sector that was far less heavily defended. The troops of the 4th Infantry Division waded ashore against light opposition, and the amphibious tanks had made it across the choppy surf without losing a single vehicle. By midday, the division had pushed 5 miles inland and linked up with elements of the parachute regiments that had dropped inland during the night. The cost for the entire day's fighting on Utah Beach was 12 men killed. It was the smoothest amphibious landing the Allies ever conducted. Behind Utah Beach, the airborne landings of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had scattered paratroopers across the swamps and fields of the Cotentin Peninsula. High winds had blown many of them far from their drop zones, and most of the heavy equipment was lost in the marshes. What seemed like a disaster at the tactical level, however, proved to be a strategic advantage. The widespread and chaotic pattern of the landings created immense confusion among the German commanders behind the beaches. Patrols reported paratroopers everywhere, and the defenders could not tell where the main threat lay. The commander of the German 91st Division, the primary reserve for the peninsula, was killed when a small group of paratroopers ambushed his staff car. The German response to the Utah Beach landings never materialized in strength. The British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches followed a different pattern. Here, the Germans had prepared their defenses with care, and the outer crust of the Atlantic Wall was reinforced by concrete bunkers, minefields, and anti-tank ditches. The planners had learned from the disaster at Dieppe, however, and they had prepared accordingly. Major General Percy Hobart's specialized tanks, the so-called funnies, were deployed in their first large-scale combat test. The flail tanks churned ahead of the infantry, their rotating chains exploding mines in wide paths. The bridge-laying tanks drove up to the seawall and dropped their metal ramps, allowing the following vehicles to cross. The fascine carriers dumped bundles of logs into the anti-tank ditches, filling them in minutes. The Churchill tanks with their massive petard mortars fired direct hits on the concrete bunkers, blowing them open one by one at Gold Beach. A single cruiser fired a 6-inch shell through the forward slit of the largest emplacement on the beach, detonating the magazine inside. The German coastal infantry, a mix of older reservists and conscripted Eastern Europeans, began surrendering in growing numbers. Omaha Beach was a different story entirely. The bluffs behind the beach were higher and steeper than anywhere else along the landing zones, and the German defenders of the battle-hardened 352nd Infantry Division had prepared their positions with care. The pre-dawn bombing had been frustrated by the cloud cover, and not a single bomb landed on the beach or the bluffs. The rocket-firing landing craft launched their salvos too far out, and the rockets fell short into the surf. The amphibious tanks were launched over 5,000 yards from the shore in heavy seas, and all but 5 of the 32 foundered and sank. The troops waded ashore under machine gun fire from the flanks, and the beach obstacles were still largely intact. The rising tide narrowed the strip of sand, crushing wounded men and vehicles against the obstacles. For several hours, the outcome at Omaha Beach hung in the balance. The naval commanders on the scene made their own decision without waiting for higher approval. American destroyers moved in to within 1,000 yards of the shoreline, scraping the bottom of the channel, and opened fire directly at the German bunkers. A few bulldozer tanks managed to cut gaps through the wire, and small groups of infantry climbed the bluffs through the draws. By late afternoon, the troops of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had established a lodgment less than a mile deep. The cost was heavy, over 2,000 casualties on a single stretch of sand, but the beachhead held, and the follow-on waves began to pour ashore. Rommel's panzers, held back by Hitler's order, never reached the beach. Admiral Ramsay's planners had known from the beginning that the invasion could not rely on capturing a port in the first days. The German defences at Cherbourg and Le Havre were too strong, and any attempt to seize a harbour by direct assault would be as futile as at Dieppe. The solution was the Mulberry Artificial Harbours, a concept that had been developed in secret over the previous 2 years. Over 1.5 million tons of steel and concrete had been fabricated into enormous caissons. Each was the size of a multi-story building. They could be towed across the channel on flat barges and sunk into position off the beaches. Floating piers and steel roadways connected the caissons to the shore. On June the 9th, the first caissons were anchored off the coast. The following day, the outer breakwaters, formed by scuttling old merchant ships, were in place. The flow of reinforcements and supplies began to accelerate immediately. The Mulberry harbours were still being assembled when the weather turned again. On the morning of June the 19th, a full Atlantic gale struck the coastline, the worst storm to hit the channel in several decades. The wind tore the American Mulberry Harbour apart, scattering its caissons across the beach and sinking 800 smaller craft. All traffic across the channel was halted for 3 days. and the Allied timetable was set back by weeks. The German command, encouraged by the storm, prepared for a counterattack. But the storm passed, the waters calmed, and the aerial patrols resumed. The British Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches survived the gale intact and continued to receive supplies. By the end of the first month, over 1 million men had been landed in Normandy. The German counteroffensive never came in strength. While the battle for Normandy continued through June and July, the other great amphibious operation of the summer was unfolding on the opposite side of the world. On the morning of June the 15th, the Fifth Fleet under Admiral Raymond Spruance arrived off the coast of Saipan in the Marianas. The landing force included 127,000 troops, carrying more firepower than any previous American assault force. The pre-invasion bombardment was far more thorough than at Tarawa. The older battleships fired at close range for over 2 hours, and the newer fast battleships joined in once the carrier aircraft had neutralized the Japanese airfields on the island. The amphibious tractors that had been developed after the Tarawa disaster churned across the fringing reef without getting stuck. Within 20 minutes, 8,000 Marines were on the beach. Within 24 hours, 20,000 men were ashore. Spruance's caution defined his command. He kept his fast carrier task force close to the islands, refusing to be drawn into a pursuit of the Japanese fleet. The Japanese had prepared a trap, using their remaining carriers as a decoy to lure the American carriers away from the beachhead. Spruance refused to take the bait. He knew that his primary mission was to protect the amphibious force unloading on Saipan, and he judged that responsibility to be more important than sinking enemy ships. The Japanese plan unraveled when their aircraft found no empty ocean to attack, only an alerted and waiting American fleet. The clash that followed on June the 19th became known as the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Mark Mitscher commanded Task Force 58, the concentration of fast carriers that had been assembled over the preceding year. The task force included 15 carriers, 7 fast battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. Their aircraft were the F-6F Hellcats, which had been designed specifically to counter the Japanese Zero. The Hellcat was tougher, faster, and better armed than its opponent. Its air crews had trained intensively over the previous months, and many of them had combat experience from the earlier campaigns in the Solomons and the Marshalls. The Japanese launched their strikes in waves, sending over 400 aircraft against the American fleet over the course of the day. The Hellcats rose to meet them, and the difference in performance was overwhelming. The Zero could outmaneuver the Hellcat in a turning fight, but the American pilots had learned not to turn with them. They used their speed and diving ability to slash through the Japanese formations, firing their heavy machine guns from passes that the Zeros could not evade. The American carriers had also been equipped with the new proximity fuses for their 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, which exploded near the target rather than requiring a direct hit. The combination of superior fighter tactics and advanced gunnery tore the Japanese air groups apart. At the end of the day, the Japanese had lost over 300 aircraft. The American losses were 29. The engagement was immediately dubbed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The destruction of Japanese naval aviation did not end on the first day. The surviving Japanese fleet had launched its aircraft with the intention of landing them on Guam, but the American carriers had already neutralized the airfields on that island. Dozens of Japanese pilots, low on fuel and with no place to land, ditched their planes in the sea. On the second day, Mitscher launched a long-range strike at the retreating Japanese fleet, sinking a carrier and damaging several other warships. The total Japanese aircraft losses over the 2 days approached 500. More importantly, the trained pilots who had flown those aircraft were irreplaceable. The Japanese Navy had committed its remaining experienced air crews to the battle, and most of them were gone. Yamamoto's earlier warning about the fleet's vulnerability without air cover had been vindicated, but he did not live to see it. The submarine force also played its part in the Marianas campaign, though from a different direction. The redesigned torpedoes, rushed to the fleet after the Mark 14 fiasco, were now operating at full effectiveness. American submarines had been positioned around the Japanese fleet bases, and they gave early warning of the enemy's movements. One boat, the Harder, sank 5 Japanese destroyers in 4 days, while reporting the fleet's departure from Tawi-Tawi. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American submarines sank 2 of the largest Japanese carriers, including the Taiho, which went down with most of its air group still on board. The Japanese Navy's reliance on radio communications, which the codebreakers at Pearl Harbor had learned to read with increasing fluency, meant that the submarines were often waiting in exactly the right position when the enemy emerged from port. The island of Saipan fell on July the 9th after 3 weeks of bitter fighting. The Japanese garrison of over 30,000 men fought to the last man, launching large-scale banzai charges in the final days. The American losses were heavy, approaching 13,000 casualties, but the capture of the island was a strategic blow from which Japan could not recover. The Marianas were the inner ring of the Japanese defensive perimeter, the territory that Imperial General Headquarters had considered essential to protect the homeland. With Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in American hands, the distance from American air bases to Tokyo was reduced to less than 1,500 miles. The flat terrain of Tinian made it particularly suitable for building long runways, and the Seabees began construction before the last Japanese resistance had been eliminated. The Tinian landing itself on July the 24th was a model of how to conduct an amphibious assault against a prepared position. The American commanders staged a feint off the main port of Tinian town, drawing the Japanese defenders toward the obvious landing site. The actual assault was launched against 2 tiny beaches on the north coast, designated White 1 and White 2. These beaches were too narrow for a conventional landing, being barely wide enough to accommodate 8 amphibious tractors at a time. The Seabees had prepared special ramps that could be deployed over the coral cliffs, allowing the landing craft to offload their troops and equipment onto the narrow shore. The Japanese command had dismissed these beaches as unusable for a large-scale landing. By the end of the first day, 15,000 Marines were ashore, and the island was effectively isolated. The Japanese garrison fought to the last man, as on Saipan, but the American casualties were far lower. The Seabees began work on the airfields almost immediately. Within hours of the last organized resistance on Tinian, the bulldozers were leveling the sugarcane fields and grinding coral rubble for the runway foundations. Over the next few weeks, the construction battalions built 5 major airfields across the Marianas, each capable of handling the new B-29 superfortress. The basing of the B-29s in China and India had always been a temporary expedient, limited by the enormous logistical cost of flying fuel and bombs over the Himalayan hump. From the Marianas, the bombers could reach Japan directly, carrying full bomb loads without the need for intermediate staging. The first B-29s began arriving on Tinian in October of 1944, and on November the 24th, 111 of them bombed Tokyo. The strategic consequences of the summer of 1944 were decisive. In Europe, the Normandy beachheads were firmly established. The German command had been unable to mount the crushing counterattack that Rommel had warned was necessary. The Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the Allied armies were pouring into France. In the Pacific, the Marianas campaign had shattered the inner defensive perimeter, placing Japan within range of sustained strategic bombing. The Japanese Navy had lost the bulk of its remaining carrier air power, and its surface fleet was increasingly vulnerable to attack from American submarines, which had finally received torpedoes that could be relied upon to work. The two-front war that the Axis powers had always feared was now reality, and the initiative had passed to the Allies. The cost of these operations had been high. The butcher's bill for D-Day alone was under 5,000 casualties, far lower than the planners had feared, but every single one was a loss felt by a unit, a ship, a family. Omaha Beach took the heaviest toll, with over 2,000 American dead and wounded. The British and Canadian beaches lost another 1,700 men. The airborne divisions added almost 1,000 more casualties to the total. The planners had anticipated much heavier losses, perhaps as many as 10,000 men on the first day. The fact that the actual number was lower was a testament to the months of preparation, the specialized equipment, the deception operations that had kept the German panzer divisions waiting in the wrong place, and the willingness of junior officers and non-commissioned officers to take the initiative when the plan broke down. In the Pacific, the Marianas campaign cost over 16,000 American casualties, including more than 3,000 dead. The Japanese losses were far higher, approaching 50,000 dead from the garrisons on Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, plus the destruction of the naval air groups. The island-hopping campaign that began with the bloody lessons of Tarawa had reached its culminating point. The inner ring was broken. The road to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and the home islands stretched out ahead, and each step would be contested with the same fanatical determination that the Marines had encountered on the coral sands of Betio. But the strategic logic of the Pacific War had now shifted irreversibly. The B-29 bases were being built, and the submarine blockade was tightening every month. The amphibious operations of the summer of 1944 represented the culmination of a long learning process. The disasters at Dieppe and Tarawa had taught hard lessons about the need for specialized equipment, overwhelming fire support, and the absolute necessity of command of the air. The near disaster at Salerno had reinforced the lesson that no beachhead could be held without air superiority. The stalemate at Anzio had demonstrated the cost of caution, showing that an amphibious force must push inland immediately or risk being contained and defeated in detail. Each of these setbacks had been studied, debated, and used to refine the doctrine for the next operation. The men who orchestrated the landings in Normandy and the Marianas had not been born knowing how to do it. They had learned with their own blood on the beaches of Dieppe and Tarawa. The architects of these operations were not all present to see the final outcome. Bertram Ramsay, the admiral who had planned the naval side of the Normandy invasion with meticulous care, was killed in an aircraft crash in France in January of 1945, flying to a meeting with Montgomery. He did not see the end of the war in Europe, but his work had already secured the beachhead that made victory possible. Percy Hobart survived the war and lived long enough to see his specialized armor become a standard component of all future British amphibious operations. His funnies, born from the desperate lessons of a failed raid on a French port, had broken the crust of the most fortified coastline in history. Eisenhower, who had shouldered the burden of the Normandy decision, went on to become the 34th President of the United States before his death in 1969. Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz served as Chief of Naval Operations after the war and lived to see the dawn of the Cold War, passing away in 1966. Admiral Raymond Spruance later served as U.S. Ambassador to the Philippines and lived until 1969. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher died suddenly in 1947 from a heart attack, while still in active command. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring was tried for war crimes, sentenced to death, but later released. He died in 1960. Lord Louis Mountbatten became the last Viceroy of India and was later assassinated by the IRA in 1979. Major General John L. Lucas was relieved of command after the Anzio stalemate and finished the war training troops, dying in 1949. The B-29 runways on Tinian remained operational long after the war ended. The same airfield that launched the first superfortress raids against Tokyo later served as the base for the aircraft that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Seabees who built those runways with crushed coral and bulldozed sugarcane fields had no way of knowing that their work would be the launch pad for the final chapter of the war against Japan. They had simply done what the Marine Corps needed: carve an airfield out of a captured island as fast as humanly possible. Within weeks of the last shot on Tinian, the first B-29s were landing on the new runways, completing the chain of islands that began at Pearl Harbor and ended in the skies over Japan. The amphibious doctrine that emerged from the Second World War did not disappear when the fighting stopped. The principles that had been forged in the crucible of the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific became the foundation for the expeditionary capabilities of the American and British navies. The Mulberry Harbors, the specialized tanks, the headquarters ships, the fleet trains, the Seabee construction battalions, the carrier task forces, the coordinated air and sea control, all of these became standard elements of the amphibious toolbox. The physical remnants of these operations are still visible today. The remains of the Mulberry Harbour at Arromanches protrude from the Normandy tides. The runways of Tinian are overgrown but still traceable in the satellite imagery. They mark the places where the Allies finally solved the problem that had defeated so many previous invaders: how to land on an enemy-held shore and stay there. That is the story of how the Western Allies learned to carry the war across the sea to the enemy's doorstep, from the failed raid at Dieppe to the massive landings at Normandy and across the Pacific. It was not the story of a single weapon or commander, but of a system that encouraged problem solvers at every level to learn from failure and build better tools and tactics each time. The culture of innovation allowed a test pilot to suggest putting a new engine in a promising airframe. It allowed a retired engineer to create construction battalions from scratch. It allowed a maverick armor officer to build an entire division of specialized tanks. That culture proved decisive in the amphibious campaigns that broke the Axis defensive perimeters. The dictatorships could design wonder weapons. The democracies could design a system that produced them, deployed them effectively, and kept improving them until the war was won. If you have any personal stories or family connections to the Normandy landings, the Pacific campaigns, or the men and women who made these operations possible, please share them in the comments below. We would love to hear from anyone whose parents, grandparents, or other relatives served in the amphibious forces during the Second World War. If you enjoyed this documentary and would like to support more historical content like this, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for listening, and we will see you in the next episode.